Nathan Davis sat at the head of the grand dining table, his fingers drumming lightly against the marble surface, the sound echoing through the opulent dining room. The soft hum of the city, barely audible through the thick glass windows, seemed so distant from the world within these walls. His home, perched atop a hill overlooking the sprawling city below, was the epitome of wealth and prestige. From the marble floors that glistened like polished stone to the towering crystal chandeliers that refracted light across the room, everything about the estate screamed power. The space was a monument to success, a fortress that Nathan had built with his own hands, though at times it felt more like a gilded cage. He had always been a man of business, a relentless operator in a world where deals were made not with a handshake, but with a strategy carefully crafted in boardrooms and lavishly furnished offices. His empire had grown over the years, fueled by ambition, calculated risks, and a single-minded pursuit of wealth. Yet, despite all his success, there was an emptiness, a quiet space in his life that no amount of money or power could fill. Outside of work, Nathan's life was almost devoid of personal connection. He had no real friendships, only alliances, and the only family he ever truly interacted with was his children. Ben, at 8, was a quiet boy, content with his toys, his books, and the occasional game of soccer in the yard. Emma, his younger sister, was just 5, but already she showed a tendency to withdraw into herself. Their faces, though bright and full of curiosity, were often clouded by the absence of their father. Nathan never paid much attention to this. To him, providing for his family meant ensuring that they lacked for nothing: the finest schools, clothes, toys, and trips to exotic destinations. His idea of being a good father was rooted in his financial generosity, not in the time he spent with them. He would leave early in the morning for meetings, returning late, exhausted, his mind still consumed by work. The children, as far as Nathan was concerned, were well taken care of. The house was pristine, their needs were met, and that should have been enough. Yet there was Rosa. Rosa had been a part of the Davis household long before Nathan had realized just how integral she was to the lives of his children. A quiet, discreet woman, Rosa had served the Davis family for years, never asking for much in return. She was the housekeeper, but more than that, she was the one who really ran the household. Rosa was the one who dressed the children for school, who comforted them when they were scared or sad. She was the one who tucked them into bed at night and read them stories when they felt lonely. The children adored her, and in their eyes, she was more of a mother than their own biological one. Nathan was too busy to notice. To him, Rosa was just a fixture, an indispensable cog in the machine that kept his household running smoothly. Her presence was as natural as the house itself, always there, always in the background, doing her job with unspoken grace. He didn't see the way his children's faces lit up when they ran into the kitchen to greet her in the morning. He didn't hear the laughter that bubbled up from the family room when Rosa played board games with them or helped them with their homework. Nathan was unaware of the bonds that had formed in his absence, bonds that Rosa had quietly nurtured while he worked tirelessly to build his empire. It wasn't until that particular afternoon that he began to realize how much of a presence Rosa truly was in the lives of his children. After another day of endless meetings and conference calls, Nathan retreated to his study, eager to bury himself in his work. The house, once filled with the noise of the children and the bustle of daily life, was now eerily quiet. It didn't bother him. Silence was a luxury he cherished, a brief respite from the constant hum of business and responsibility. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling gently in the crystal tumbler. His thoughts, though, were anything but peaceful. His mind was still on the boardroom, the numbers, the deals that needed to be sealed. He was always thinking ahead, always looking to the future. But for the first time, as he looked out over the city skyline, something felt off. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness. He turned to see Rosa, carrying a tray of coffee into the study. As she always did, her movements were efficient, her expression composed. But for the first time, Nathan noticed a weariness in her eyes. She placed a tray on the table in front of him, but before she could leave, He stopped her. "Rosa," he said, his voice a little more tentative than usual. "Is everything all right?" She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the children's empty seats at the dining table before she nodded. "Everything is fine, Mr. Davis," she replied, her voice as calm as ever. "The children are upstairs, playing." Nathan nodded, but the unease didn't leave him. He sat back in his chair, his gaze drifting from Rosa to the city below. For a moment, he felt the weight of his own indifference. It wasn't that he hadn't cared about his children. It was just that he had always believed that providing for them was enough. But in that quiet moment, as he watched Rosa prepare to leave, he wondered how much more there was to being a father than what he had given. As Rosa exited the room, Nathan's thoughts lingered on her, on the quiet woman who had taken on so much responsibility in the house without ever asking for anything in return. He wasn't sure why it had taken him so long to notice. But now, for the first time, he truly saw the depth of her role in their lives. His empire was built on the foundation of cold, calculated decisions. But for the first time in years, Nathan found himself questioning whether it was time to focus on something more, something that no amount of money could ever buy. Despite the wealth that surrounded Nathan, it was Rosa who truly ran the household. A quiet, efficient woman of simple means, Rosa had worked in the mansion for over a decade. She wasn't the kind of person to draw attention to herself, preferring instead to blend into the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Every inch of the mansion was polished, every room immaculate, and every meal prepared with care. It was Rosa's touch that made the house a home, at least for the children. Nathan hardly noticed her, except when she served him his coffee or tidied up after his business meetings. To him, Rosa was merely a fixture in the landscape of his life, unseen, unheard, and easily forgotten once her tasks were completed. Yet Rosa was more than just a maid. She was the one who truly took care of his children. Nathan's absences were frequent, often the result of late-night meetings, business trips, and endless phone calls. The mansion was large and lonely when he wasn't there, and the silence between father and children was often deafening. Ben and Emma, however, had become accustomed to it. At a young age, they learned that their father would rarely be home for dinner or their school performances, let alone spend time with them in a meaningful way. Rosa was the one who made them laugh, who comforted them when they were scared, and who wiped away their tears when they missed their father. She was the one who dressed them for school in the mornings, making sure their uniforms were crisp and neat. It was Rosa who kissed them good night every evening, making sure their little hearts felt safe in the absence of their father. Despite Nathan's growing fortune, his children were growing up in a home that lacked the one thing they needed most: his presence. Ben, though a quiet boy, often asked why Daddy was always away. Emma, too young to understand the complexities of business, would press her face to the window when the family car pulled away, hoping, in vain, for her father to come home. But Nathan's focus was always elsewhere, on profits, on deals, on expanding his empire. The world he created was a shining testament to his success, but it was built on the backs of people like Rosa, who made sure it all stayed in motion while he reaped the rewards. One particular evening, after a long day of meetings, Nathan returned home late. As usual, he entered the front door, expecting the silence that always greeted him. But tonight, something was different. The house seemed quieter than usual, almost as though it were holding its breath. He found Ben and Emma sitting in the sitting room, but they weren't playing or watching TV as they usually did. Instead, they were staring at the fireplace, the soft glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across their faces. Rosa, who had finished cleaning up for the night, stood at the threshold of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Nathan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. His children's silence bothered him, but it also irritated him. He wasn't used to having to interact with them. His role, in his mind, was to provide. Everything else, he assumed, was Rosa's job. He cleared his throat, but before he could speak, Rosa stepped forward. "Mr. Davis, I've noticed Emma has been a bit quiet lately. She's been asking why you don't come to her school events. I think it's bothering her," Rosa said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's brow furrowed. He didn't have time for such concerns, especially after a day filled with critical negotiations. I'm providing for them, he replied flatly. What more do they need? Rosa looked at him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. They need you, sir. Not just the things you provide, but your presence, your attention. For the first time in years, Nathan felt a shift within him. The words, though soft and unassuming, hit him like a wave. He had always thought of himself as a good father. But in that moment, something inside him cracked. He had spent so much time trying to build a legacy, a fortune that could be passed down to his children, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, the bond between father and child. Rosa's words lingered in the air long after she left the room. Nathan stood there, staring at his children, who had now turned their attention back to the fire. They were so young, and yet their faces seemed older, marked by a sadness he couldn't place. Ben was silent, lost in thought, while Emma's wide eyes seemed to ask the questions Nathan had never bothered to answer. As the days passed, Nathan found himself thinking more about his children, about how much he had missed in their lives. He couldn't remember the last time he had sat down with them, asked them about their day, or simply listened to what they had to say. But with each passing day, the guilt gnawed at him. He had been so absorbed in his work that he had missed the growing distance between himself and his children. Rosa had done everything for them, but what about him? What kind of father was he, if he couldn't even make the effort to be present in their lives? The question haunted him as he lay awake late into the night. And though Nathan tried to push it away, he couldn't deny the truth that had been laid bare before him. His children were growing up without him. And Rosa, the woman he had never truly appreciated, had been the one filling the role he should have taken on all along. As time passed, the distance between Nathan and his children seemed to widen, not through any overt fault, but through neglect, a neglect so quiet and subtle that it was easy to dismiss. Every week, Ben and Emma's world remained the same. Their toys would be carefully arranged by Rosa. Their meals would be served without fail. But their father's absence remained a constant in their lives. They were growing up in a house of marble and crystal, yet it was a house empty of the warmth they craved. For Rosa, the task of caring for the children became an unspoken duty. She wasn't their mother, but in so many ways, she felt like the one who truly raised them. It was a heavy responsibility, one that often left her emotionally drained. She knew that Nathan, for all his wealth and success, was failing as a father. She could see the toll it took on Ben, who had become withdrawn, often reading quietly in his room, hiding away from the world. Emma, on the other hand, was more open about her sorrow. She cried sometimes, asking why Daddy couldn't be there for her, why he wasn't there to watch her recite her school play lines or help her build her toy castle. Rosa would console them, telling them that their father loved them in his own way, that sometimes adults got busy, and that life was complicated. She would hold them close, running her hands through their hair, offering the kind of care Nathan never could. One evening, as the autumn air grew colder and the city lights twinkled through the window, Rosa overheard a conversation between Ben and Emma. The two were sitting at the kitchen table, their plates of half-eaten dinner pushed aside, their faces serious. "Do you think Daddy will ever be home?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Emma replied, her young face creased with confusion. "I think he's too busy with the shiny buildings and the people who talk to him in suits. He never stays." Ben nodded, his small hand tracing the rim of his glass. "Maybe he doesn't love us anymore." Rosa's heart broke at the words. She stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to their innocent pain, knowing she couldn't answer their questions. It wasn't her place to explain to them what Nathan's world truly looked like, a world of power, deals, an ambition that came at the cost of family and love. The days turned into months, and soon, a year passed. Nathan's empire continued to grow, but so did the distance between him and his children. Rosa's role in their lives deepened. She was the one they turned to when they needed comfort, when they needed someone to fill the void that Nathan's absence had created. But no matter how much she gave, the void was always there. growing larger, more pronounced. One afternoon, as Nathan came home after a particularly long trip, he found his children sitting in the living room, silently playing with their toys. The house was unusually quiet. Rosa, who had spent the day cleaning and preparing dinner, was in the kitchen, her back turned as she hummed a soft tune. Nathan stood in the doorway, his gaze flickering between his children and the woman who had become an integral part of their lives. He couldn't help but notice how Ben and Emma seemed so distant from him, their eyes not lighting up at the sight of him. As they once did, it was as if they didn't even see him anymore. He realized, with a heavy pang in his chest, that Rosa had become the one they truly relied on. The thought gnawed at him, a bitter realization of just how far he had drifted from the family he had once intended to care for. Later that evening, as Rosa served dinner, Nathan finally broke the silence. "Rosa," he began, his voice soft but firm, "you've done a lot for my family." Rosa looked up, her eyes meeting his, wary but steady. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Davis." "No," Nathan replied, shaking his head. "You've done more than that. You've raised my children in my absence. You've been more of a parent to them than I have." He trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. For the first time in a long while, Rosa felt the weight of Nathan's words. They weren't just an acknowledgement. They were a recognition of the role she had played in his children's lives, a role that no amount of money or success could replace. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken emotions. Ben and Emma, sensing the change in the atmosphere, looked up from their plates, but neither spoke. Finally, Rosa placed her fork down, her hands trembling ever so slightly. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, "you can't buy time. You can't buy love. Your children need you. They don't need your money or your business deals. They need you, and you need them too." Nathan didn't respond at first. He didn't have the words. But as he sat there, looking at Rosa, at Ben and Emma, he realized the truth of what she said. He had spent so much time building his empire that he had neglected the very thing that mattered most. And that night, for the first time in years, Nathan Davis made a decision.